Whenever I lose my bearings in trying to think about pedagogy and classroom teaching and learning, what the role of the student is, the role of the teacher, the role of assessment and performance, whether it's summative assessment or formative assessment, I find it useful to step back out of the context of the classroom and ask myself what a similar question would look and sound like and what the answer would be in the context of sports or the context of the performing arts. So take the orchestra performance, take the dance recital. In my case, I have a background in sports, so I will use an example from, let's say, soccer. And think about the role that the coach plays and the role that practice plays and the role that scrimmage within a practice plays vis-a-vis the scheduled performances, which is to say the games, and how the coach is ever mindful at every practice how the team performed in the previous game, when the next game is, who they're preparing to face. And during the game, they know that they'll never be able to walk on the field and kick the ball when the ref blows the whistle. So they understand that their role is always to the side and always as an aid and always thinking about how to structure practices in order to simulate what the performance task will look like, which is to say the game. And that is, I find, a very useful way to think about all of the moving parts in, call it a learning equation of what is happening in a classroom. Sometimes a teacher will be doing too much of the work for students and they'll need to step back. And sometimes the way to think about that is to think of that role as being a coach. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer at Newsela. I took a long time to get to my introduction because I'm super interested in this topic and I'm really excited to dive in. With that, let me introduce this article here that is the feature of the conversation of this episode. This is AI in the Classroom Daily, and we're going to be talking about the role that AI can and should play in the innovation of assessments of learning. And there was recently a panel discussion on a webinar led by Eric Tucker from Getting Smart, and he wrote a little blog here that summarizes that conversation. We'll share both in the show notes. And I wanted to dive into some of the topics that the comments that the panelists made, because I thought they were really insightful, a bunch of great heavy-hitting panelists. And I think there are really some exciting opportunities where we won't just see time savings and we won't just see optimization of current methods of assessment. If we do this right, we'll actually see innovation that will broaden our understanding, deepen understanding, make our understanding more responsive to classroom learning, to the moves that teachers and coaches, let's say, can make in the moment during the practice of the classroom lesson, but also the way that they think about structuring those performance tasks and the range of things that they can sustainably evaluate over time in a scalable way that doesn't result in burnout. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with Jay McTighe about the implications for state assessment, state level assessment of thinking more broadly about the understanding by design principles when applied to assessment. And Jay had written a piece suggesting a few different methods for how you might scale these practices. But what I recall from the conversation was that a big part of it was solving for scale. That is, you couldn't do quite the same thing for every student because it was understood that each of those efforts to evaluate performance was pretty heavy lift for the assessor. And so let's get into this conversation and see how the panelists are talking about unblocking some of those barriers to more innovative assessment, more innovative learning through assessment, and what the implications are for AI. So one of their provocative sort of premises of the question is that this is really an opportunity to revisit the question for whom we measure. If you think about the state test and you think about a lot of the efforts in a lot of classrooms are rolling up to the state test, rolling up to some summative assessment, whether it's at the state level or in some other setting, those assessment data are really used by administrators. That is, for policy at the district level, maybe at the school level even, adjusting schedules and such. But it's very hard for those data to be made actionable for teachers, especially in those end-of-year assessments. And that's where there's the possibility, because it's so labor intensive to administer those assessments, AI may unlock a potential to think about assessment differently, not just how it's delivered, but what it's measuring, how the data itself is being used, and its very purpose. And so there's two buckets here we can consider the risk. The risk is that we're basically going to be optimizing the delivery and evaluation and analysis that we're already doing. That's as far as we're going to get with AI. But the opportunity, which I think is real, it really feels like it may be available to us, is that this is going to rebalance, I think, in the words of the panelists, who the assessment serves and the utility of the assessment. And that's going to make assessment, from when I was a teacher, it never really felt like, I wouldn't say it was a dirty word, but it definitely wasn't something I looked forward to. Definitely wasn't something I looked forward to as a student, but players look forward to performing. Musicians look forward, dancers look forward. They want to show what they know. They want to be given the opportunity to demonstrate this in an authentic context. And I think the authenticity has really been sapped of the assessment routine, the assessment rituals, and the culture of school, as much as it's built around these assessments. And the ownership of the assessment, from who creates it to how it's used, is really not at the classroom level. And that's really a shame, because students bear direct consequence of that situation. So briefly, 4 panelists, Linda Darling-Hammond from Learning Policy Institute is really trying to provoke the panel, or provoke the audience to think about design assessments themselves as learning experiences. You talk to players, you talk to performers, they're learning in the performance themselves. They're learning from the game, and it's possible to use assessment as a learning exercise. Elizabeth Machier-Horner, I may be mispronouncing that, apologies, from Gates Foundation, is worrying just about that build a faster horse phenomenon, that we may just make everything in the image of what we have today, and we may not be able to think fully and clearly about everything that's available to us. One example she gave is the advantages we already see in using AI to listen to students' voices. Of course, there are consequences to the way that the models are trained, and we have to be very careful that we don't lose sight of equity in the training of those models. But simply the ability to scale the listening ear to hear more students more of the time can open real doors for us. Paul Lemahieu, I'm also probably mispronouncing this as well, really thinking about how the data that we're going to see is not just backward looking, but is forward looking, and is a way to think about what's going to come next and what are we anticipating for this student, not just what are we seeing in the rearview mirror. And John Hattie, I thought, asked a really good question with a piece of data that he shared, was that they have 12,000 hours of transcripts and of classroom teaching and learning. And in those, he said that they heard 0 invitations from teachers to students to think aloud through an exercise, through a problem, through a classroom learning situation. And again, with this voice capture, I think that's maybe where some focus of the panel is thinking about, is that we can listen to more kids more of the time, and we can do more dynamic things with the voices that we hear. But again, if you ask the wrong question, as John Hattie says, you get the wrong result. And so it's all about the intention we have behind the use of the AI in innovating in assessments. And so there are 3 points that the panel is making here. The design intent. What are we trying to do here? We have to think about routines and infrastructure and culture, not as an afterthought, but as part of the development of this innovation and assessment. And then the assessment literacy, really giving students ownership of their own data and helping them understand, just the way we would prepare our players, what it's going to look like, what are the rules of the game, how will we keep score of your performance, how are we going to digest together as a team after the fact, what are we going to watch some video? Am I going to coach you differently? When I lead practice on Monday, it's going to be with reference to the game that we played on Saturday, so that there's a through line and we understand how you as a player are developing, how we as a team are developing. All of that is part of the literacy around the assessment. This was a slide that I took specifically to call out some of the points that John Hattie was making, because I think he really has his finger on the pulse of a lot of what's possible here. So I mentioned this idea of continuous support, and I think a lot of that has to do with how difficult it is to implement an assessment right now, and how much of an inauthentic exercise it is, and how hard it is to interweave into classroom practice. There are major benefits, but we know, and I don't need to go into the guardrails, but we acknowledge there are definitely guardrails that are needed here. Currently, AI feedback tends towards the more superficial because that's what's nearest at hand. But we see these models improving day after day. And I think we're going to be able to get to the development of assessments that are capable of assessing deeper learning. And that's a pretty exciting prospect. Already, he's seeing that AI feedback shows learning and motivation gains, and we've seen that in our own work with the use of Nutella writing, for example. Giving students timely, specific feedback about their writing doesn't have to be perfect. It can create an opportunity for their own agency, but it moves the ball forward. It helps them iterate. It helps them think and reflect and take the next step more independently. But this is not about taking the teacher out of the classroom. The teacher, just like you wouldn't send the team into the game without the coach or run a practice without a coach. We've all been to player-led practices. They are okay. They have redeeming aspects, but you need a mentor. You need a coach. You need someone who can help direct and structure the learning. And I'll just mention, because a lot of what we're talking about here is the dynamic nature of the AI innovation, like what it could actually help us innovate on that's different from what we currently see. We're starting to see some like slightly more innovative item types in state assessments, but it's really just scratching the surface. This is a screenshot from one of our products, Formative, as the name implies, formative assessment. Just the number of, and this is today, I took this screenshot just yesterday. So this is what's possible today with the number of different item types on that platform. And we just see a tremendous opportunity to innovate. And again, when we're thinking formatively, we're thinking about at the level of running a drill at practice and deciding how well is this drill simulating the efforts that we're going to need to see in our game, and what adjustments do I need to make in the midst of the drill? How do I want to structure a scrimmage? What do I want to practice? And what kinds of dynamic scenarios do I want to reproduce for the team, for individuals, for different groups and different roles to help them hone their skills and then transfer those into the performance task. I'm going back and forth very loose and goose with the metaphors here across sports because I think so many of the parallels are so salient and for me personally very inspiring. I hope you found this useful. If you've had experience with innovating in assessment, I think we want to hear from you. Please comment in the notes, and I would encourage you to open source your assessments, make them available. This is an opportunity. This is a moment when at the classroom level, there is a fast and furious pace and opportunity for innovation. So I think that's where we're going to see the most exciting developments is up from the ground level, so to speak, in practice, in classrooms. And hopefully we can all stand to learn from that. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.